All my life, I thought I'd learn to live with being second best. It started small, my brother's picture always front and center on the mantle. His trophies polished while my certificates ended up in drawers. His birthday parties thrown like royal events while mine were family only. I told myself it didn't matter. That favoritism was just a shadow I could walk out of one day. But shadows cling longer than we think. I built my own path step by step, dollar by dollar, until one day I looked at the balance sheet of my life and realized I was worth more than my parents or my brother had ever imagined. $13 million. That number was freedom, a wall of protection, and a secret. But secrets never stay quiet when envy has ears. The day my brother found out wasn't the day he congratulated me. It was the day his voice turned sharp, his face twisted, and he unleashed years of resentment in one terrifying outburst. And in that moment, I finally understood the cost of being the child who learned to survive in silence. He exploded. And in that instant, I realized all those years of silent endurance, all the times I swallowed being second best, had turned into the sharpest blade aimed right back at me. He screamed that it wasn't fair, that I hadn't earned a dime, that my entire life I'd been the forgotten one while our parents had built his path with gold bricks, and yet somehow I was the one who ended up ahead. His voice cracked as he hurled his phone against the wall and stomped across the shards as if crushing glass could crush my independence. But I just stood there, strangely calm, because in his rage there wasn't truth. Only years of entitlement boiling over, and finally, the mask slipped. I saw the brother I had always known hiding beneath the polished golden child exterior. The boy who got brand new bikes while I rode his hand-me-downs, who got our mother's soft hand smoothing his hair while mine was pushed away with the excuse that his sensitivity required more care, who had our father at every single game shouting his name from the stands while I scanned empty chairs at my school plays. I lived in that shadow and taught myself to smile through it. But as he roared about my 13 million, spittle flying and eyes wild, I understood something I had never let myself admit before. He couldn't stand that I had built a life without their approval, and that truth was burning him alive. He paced like a caged animal, muttering numbers under his breath. 13 million, 13 million, as though repeating it would somehow make it less real. His fists clenched and unclenched. And I remembered every time he used to sneer at my choices, calling my jobs meaningless, my investments silly, my careful saving a waste of time. He laughed when I spent nights studying markets, when I worked overtime shifts instead of going out. He called me boring. He called me invisible, but invisibility had been my shield. It gave me freedom to build quietly, brick by brick, while he stood in the spotlight burning under the weight of everyone's expectations. And now the balance had flipped. He was the one choking on shadows while I held the light. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't flinch. I simply watched as his anger spiraled, and then he turned it on me with a venom I'd never heard before. He said I owed him. That half of it should have been his. That I wouldn't even know how to handle that kind of money without his advice. And I nearly laughed at the audacity. This was the same brother who once maxed out 3 credit cards in a single month, who borrowed thousands from me and never paid it back, who bragged about being the center of the family while I was left to pick up scraps. And now he thought he could stake a claim to my work, my sacrifice, my years of being overlooked. But instead of answering, I let silence stretch between us. I let him see in my eyes that I wasn't the little sister he could bully into submission anymore, and the silence drove him mad. He shouted louder. He pounded his fist on the table. He called our parents to demand they speak to me, and I listened as he tried to rope them in, painting me as selfish and cold. And when I heard my mother's trembling voice over the speaker saying, "Honey, maybe she should share," something inside me cracked. Because after everything, after decades of being invisible, they still expected me to hand over the one thing that proved I had been right all along. I felt the old ache rise in my chest. The same ache I used to carry when I was 10 years old, and overheard my father saying I'd be fine on my own, but that my brother needed their help. The same ache from every holiday when the biggest gift under the tree had his name on it, and I unwrapped socks with a forced smile. But this time I refused to swallow it. I refused to play the role they had written for me. I told them calmly that the money was mine, earned without their hand, without their blessing, without their love. And I wasn't going to apologize for building what they insisted I'd never have. My brother screamed into the phone that I was tearing the family apart, as though family wasn't already broken the moment they chose favorites, as though loyalty meant endless sacrifice to him and silence from me. I said one line that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. I don't owe you for the years you erased me, and the quiet that followed was heavier than his shouting. Because they all knew it was true, he tried to recover, promising he could manage it better than me, swearing he would invest it in ways I couldn't understand, bragging about his contacts and his so-called business sense, and I had to bite my tongue not to remind him of the foreclosure he barely dodged, the lawsuits whispered behind his back, the late-night phone calls begging me to cover his rent. But the truth is, I didn't need to remind him, because every failure sat in his own chest like stones he couldn't shake. And when I finally said, "This conversation is over," his face twisted with something darker than anger. It was desperation, the kind that makes people reckless. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. I was prepared. That night he showed up at my door uninvited, pounding so hard the frame shook, his voice carrying through the walls as he demanded I open up. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Lights flicked on across the street. But I stood still behind the locked door, phone in hand, every fiber of me refusing to bend. When he finally realized I wasn't going to let him in, he shouted through the wood that I was a disgrace, that I was nothing without the family name, that he'd tell everyone I was greedy and ungrateful, and I almost laughed because for once his threats didn't pierce me. They bounced off the armor I had built. He had no idea I'd already anticipated this moment years ago, quietly preparing, keeping records of every loan, every message, every signature of his when he borrowed from me. I had file folders stacked neatly with evidence that painted the truth of who he was, evidence I never used out of pity, but now I saw it for what it was: protection. I sat on the couch listening to his rage outside until it burned itself down to silence, until the sound of his car peeling away cut the night open. And in that emptiness, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't victory. It was freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop begging people to see your worth. The next morning, he tried again with calls and texts, this time playing the victim, claiming he'd been blindsided, that I should have warned him, that money like that should belong to both of us. And then, when I didn't answer, he dragged our parents into it again, and I heard my father's voice on voicemail saying, "Families share, don't be selfish," and my mother crying softly in the background. And for a moment the old guilt tugged at me. But then I remembered every year they had told me to step aside so he could shine. Every time they used the word selfish, when I simply wanted something of my own. And I knew then that this was not selfishness. This was survival. I was not going to set myself on fire just to keep them warm. And if they wanted to see me as the villain for once, I was ready to play that role. Days turned into weeks and the pressure only escalated. My brother started showing up at my workplace, waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his car with that smug grin he wore whenever he thought he had the upper hand. Except this time his eyes were bloodshot and desperate. He cornered me near the entrance one afternoon, telling me that if I didn't do the right thing, he'd take me to court, that he had friends who could make things difficult. And I just stared at him, because even in his threat there was a tremor of fear. He knew I had the receipts. He knew I had years of messages where he begged me for money, contracts he signed without reading, proof of transfers I never saw returned. And when I finally said, "Try me," he froze. Because deep down he had always counted on me folding, always counted on my silence, and I wasn't that girl anymore. I walked past him and left him standing there with his empty threats. But it didn't stop him. Soon he was telling extended family that I had betrayed him, twisting the story so that cousins and aunts started calling, asking if it was true, if I was really hoarding money while my brother struggled, and every call felt like another replay of my childhood, their voices heavy with disappointment, their questions always framed in a way that made me the problem. And yet instead of breaking me, it steeled me, because I could finally see the pattern so clearly. I had been cast as the scapegoat since birth, blamed when I was quiet, blamed when I spoke, blamed for succeeding without permission. And once you see the script you've been trapped in, you can finally rewrite it. So I did. I sent a calm, one-line group message to every relative who had called me. My finances are mine. My brother is not entitled to them. End of discussion. And then I muted them all. The silence that followed was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I knew the war wasn't over, liberating because for the first time in my life I had chosen myself, and that choice was worth more than every dollar in the bank. At 50%, I had mapped the battlefield and knew every move he could make. He tried whispers and threats. Lawyers' names dropped like grenades. An aunt forwarded a screenshot with a caption meant to shame me. My inbox filled with pleas and ultimatums. But I turned every attempt into proof of intent. Texts, voicemails, screenshots of his threats, recorded calls where he begged me for loans and promised to pay back soon, bank transfers with missing memo lines, his signature on IOUs he never honored, and I quietly went to work with a lawyer I trusted. Not to surrender, but to protect what was mine. We set up corporate protections, moved assets into proper trusts, created clear documentation that showed every dollar's origin so there could be no question of theft or impropriety. I filed a cease and desist for harassment when he followed me to work and loitered in the lobby. Not to escalate, but to create boundaries that the family had never taught him to respect, my lawyer sent a polite, clinical letter explaining that any attempt to seize assets would trigger countersuits for harassment, slander, and fraud because the truth was on my side and I was finally prepared to use it. And when he thought he could sway public opinion by posting sob stories on social media, I responded not with drama, but with a single post, a short, factual statement that the money was earned independently and that I would not negotiate extortion. It wasn't vindictive, it was firm, and it made the narrative harder to twist. People who had always sided with him began to ask questions. Distant cousins who had taken his side called back with softer voices. Some even apologized when I calmly presented them with the receipts of every loan I had quietly covered for him. The lawyers in his circle stopped returning his calls when the potential legal exposure became clear. And in the quiet of that new perimeter, I found a strange, slow satisfaction. Not the glee my brother expected, but the relief of a woman who no longer needed permission to exist. I began to reclaim parts of my life I'd given away. My weekends back, dinners without passive-aggressive lectures, invitations where my presence was not a competition, and with each small reclaiming the old wounds from childhood scabbed over a little. Not gone, but manageable. And when he escalated to threats about legacy and family name, I filed the paperwork to formalize my separation from family financial entanglements. No joint accounts, no shared investments. A clear legal division that made his claims legally untenable and morally hollow. He ranted that I was cold, that I had betrayed blood, but the ledger doesn't care about sentiment. It only cares about signatures and dates and verifiable transfers. And when the estate lawyer called to confirm there would be no automatic claims based on family assumptions, I felt something like vindication but quieter. Justice dressed as paperwork, and it was devastating to him because it showed that I had prepared for the moment he only now realized would come. He tried one last gambit, threatening to leak old family secrets and to embarrass me publicly. But I had already preempted his power by telling my truth in measured terms to people who mattered and by putting legal fences around my life. In the end, his anger turned inward. He started to self-destruct in ways that could not be blamed on me. Missed rent notices, angry calls from vendors, a reputation for instability that made potential partners and collaborators think twice. And while I never wanted him to fall, watching him stumble without my hand on the wheel of his fate felt like the final lesson my parents never taught, that people receive the consequences of their choices, whether you participate or not. So I walked away from the table, with my head held steady, documents in order, boundaries enforced, and a quiet plan for the future that didn't include rescuing anyone who had spent a lifetime taking me for granted. The breaking point came when my parents summoned me to what they called a family meeting, as though we were children again sitting around the dining table, as though decades of favoritism could be erased with a pot of coffee and stern looks. I went because part of me still wanted closure, but the moment I walked in and saw my brother at the head of the table, pacing with printed spreadsheets he barely understood, I knew it wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. He launched into a speech about unity and fairness, his voice shaking as he demanded that I set up a family fund with my money, that I contribute a portion each year to help everyone stay afloat. My parents nodded solemnly, as if this was reasonable, as if it wasn't exploitation dressed up as tradition. I listened without interrupting, without raising my voice, and then I calmly slid across the table a binder I had brought with me. Page after page of loans, texts, contracts, bank receipts, the financial history that showed how many times he had used me as his personal ATM. The silence in the room was thick as my father flipped through pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each one. My mother's hands trembled. My brother tried to laugh it off, calling it petty accounting, but the facts were louder than his charm. I told them this wasn't about money, it was about respect, about the years of being overlooked and erased. And that from this day forward, I was no longer participating in a family dynamic where my worth depended on what I gave up. My brother erupted again, slamming his fist, calling me cruel, accusing me of tearing the family apart. But this time I didn't shrink, I didn't apologize. I stood, gathered my binder, and told them simply, "I am done being your scapegoat," and walked out. The slam of the door behind me felt like the closing of a book I had been trapped in since childhood. But the story wasn't over, because leaving them behind also meant facing the fallout. Within days, cousins messaged me, some with sympathy, some with venom. Old family friends reached out with gossip, and my brother took to social media again, painting himself as the victim of my betrayal. Yet what he didn't know was that the legal cease and desist had already been filed, that every post he made only added to the pile of evidence, that the more he shouted, the clearer it became who he really was. The man who had always been handed everything and still thought he was owed more, while I was the woman who had been handed nothing and built everything. And in that contrast, the truth began to shine through for people who had never noticed before. By the time it reached 75% of the storm, I could feel the tide turning. My brother's tantrums were no longer commanding the sympathy they once had. Extended relatives stopped calling as often. Some even admitted they were embarrassed to have taken his side. And my parents' voices grew quieter with each conversation, though they never admitted fault. They started asking me about boundaries in a hesitant tone, as if realizing too late that their golden child had cracked under the weight of his own entitlement. Meanwhile, my brother doubled down, filing a hollow legal claim that my assets were family property. And when his attorney received the mountain of documentation from mine, proof of independent income, investment histories, and the loans he owed me, the claim evaporated in less than a week. His lawyer withdrew, leaving him scrambling. Furious and exposed, it should have been satisfying. But what I felt was something different. Exhaustion. A bone-deep tiredness from carrying the burden of being the forgotten one turned scapegoat, and then turning myself into my own protector. Yet even in that exhaustion, there was clarity. I realized I no longer needed to win his approval, or even his downfall. I only needed to protect my peace, so I went further. I sold the old family house deed I had inherited quietly years ago, not out of revenge, but because it was a symbol of chains. And with the proceeds, I set up a trust fund. Not for him, not for them, but for causes I believed in. Scholarships for girls who grew up hearing they weren't enough. Funds for women starting businesses after being told they should settle. It was my way of converting pain into something unbreakable. When he found out, he lost his mind again, screaming that I was giving away his legacy, that I was throwing the family's future to strangers. But it wasn't his legacy. It never had been. It was mine. And by choosing to give it away on my terms, I was rewriting the ending. Not with fire or fury, but with boundaries and intention. And though his voice echoed for weeks in desperate texts and half-hearted apologies, I didn't answer, because sometimes the loudest revenge is silence. And in that silence, I finally heard my own life calling me forward. When the dust seemed to settle, the quiet was almost unnerving. But beneath it, I could sense my brother scheming again, like a storm brewing out of sight, and sure enough, he tried one last desperate maneuver, reaching out not to me, but to journalists, spinning a tale of a broken family and a greedy sister who stole her brother's rightful inheritance. He painted himself as a tragic figure, the overlooked son burdened with responsibility, while I, the selfish sibling, hoarded millions. But what he underestimated was how much evidence already existed in my hands. I didn't go on a campaign, I didn't scream or cry on camera. I let the facts speak for themselves. A quiet leak of documents, his unpaid debts, his texts begging for cash, his defaulted contracts, circulated in whispers until his narrative collapsed. The reporters backed off, the story fizzled, and he was left looking not like a victim, but a man undone by his own lies. My parents called again, not to defend him this time, but to plead for me to help him. They said he was losing everything, that he was at his lowest, and maybe a part of me wanted to reach for the girl I used to be, the one who would have rushed in to fix it, but that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood that enabling someone is not love, that throwing lifelines to someone who only drags you under is not compassion. I told them gently but firmly that I would not step in, that my brother's choices were his to carry, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel guilty saying it. Instead, I felt a strange serenity, as though a weight had lifted that I didn't even know I still bore. The calls from relatives slowed. The whispers dulled. My brother grew quieter too. Though I knew it wasn't peace, but exhaustion from battles he could no longer win, and as the noise faded, I turned back to my own life. The career I had built, the home that finally felt like mine, the small circle of friends who saw me not as a wallet or a rival, but as a person. I began traveling without telling anyone, booking flights on a whim, standing at cliff sides in countries my family never bothered to visit, feeling the air of freedom on my face. And in those moments, I realized that money hadn't saved me. Clarity had. The clarity to see the truth of my family dynamic, the clarity to draw a line and never step back over it. And as I watched the horizon stretch endless and untouchable, I understood that the greatest revenge wasn't the binder of receipts or the legal victories. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I was untethered, unafraid, and completely, undeniably free. In the end, my brother faded from my daily life like a shadow. When the sun finally rises, I heard through distant cousins that he sold his car, that he moved out of his apartment, that he still muttered about the fortune he believed should have been his. But his words no longer reached me. My parents grew old and brittle, still clinging to the dream that their golden child would shine again. But even they stopped asking me to fix what was broken. And that silence was its own strange apology. I never needed them to confess their favoritism. I only needed to prove to myself that I was never the problem. I didn't build $13 million out of spite. I built it out of survival, out of grit, out of the quiet refusal to stay small, and that became my armor, my independence, my revenge. I live now without looking over my shoulder. I donate when I want. I invest where I believe. I spend on joy without shame. And every time I sign my name on a document or transfer funds that belong only to me, I feel the echo of a little girl who once sat at a table watching her brother unwrap the biggest gift while she smiled through socks and silence. And I whisper to her, "You made it. You were always enough. Family can be a wound, but it can also be a teacher, and mine taught me the hardest truth of all. Love without respect is not love at all." So I closed the chapter not with fire, but with a key turning in a lock, a door that will never open the same way again. And as I step forward into the life I carved with my own 2 hands, I ask myself only one question. Was it revenge? Or was it finally justice? And maybe those two are the same. Maybe the purest revenge is living untouched by those who once tried to erase you. I don't yell, I don't cry, I just exist freely. And sometimes that is the sharpest blade of all.